12 years ago to the day, May 1st, 2004, I walked into a meeting at my law firm in England. For those of you who don't know, I was an attorney in the UK before I came into ministry in the United States. So I walked into a meeting of my fellow partners. I sat down at a round table, and I told my partners that I was leaving. I told them that God had revealed to me over a period of time that he wanted me to step down from legal practice. I'd been with the firm for 8 years, 4 of those as a partner. And I said that God wanted me to transition into ministry, and so I'd taken a position as a law professor at a nearby law school, and I was going to take a couple of years to begin the process of moving into pastoral ministry. The conversation did not go well. The meeting didn't go well. The news was not received well at all. I had oversight of our corporate law office at the time. It was a very successful office, and my partners couldn't understand why would anyone walk away from a lucrative career. And they kept saying the same phrase over and over again during that meeting. Martin, how are you going to provide for your family? Where will the money come from? Now, I've been asking myself that same question in the weeks leading up to that meeting, and in fact, I'd gone through our finances with a fine-tooth comb. We had refinanced our home. We were going to use up all of our savings to pay down as much debt as possible. You see, to go from legal practice to law professor, I would only be earning 1/4 of what I had been earning as an attorney. And so we had to go through this whole process of making sure that this was affordable and that we could see the way forward. And we had done that. In fact, I'd spoken to the firm's bank. I got a settlement statement to repay my business loan, which I'd get back from my share of the partnership. And so I had it all laid out. I left the meeting, went back to work, and a few hours later got a call from the firm's bank. They said, Martin, I know that we gave you a settlement statement just a couple of days ago, but your firm's made a few financial transactions over the last few days, and that has increased your share of the firm's liability to us. So the amount that you now need to repay us is X much higher. And it was a huge sum of money. And I about died. I mean, it was like an atomic bomb went off in our lives. It was as though our whole world imploded. And I didn't know what to do. You know, we prayed about this. We'd taken counsel from trusted friends. We'd been really good financial stewards, and we were certain God was asking us to do something. And yet, at that stage, I could not see the way forward. It was like there was a financial mountain right there, and I couldn't see a way over or around it. And all I kept thinking over and over again was, where will the money come from? How will I provide? Now, I'm going to imagine, I've got this number of people here this morning, that a number, perhaps most of you, perhaps someone even right now, this morning, is at that mountain looking at an insurmountable financial hurdle and asking, where will the money come from? And it could be money to make rent this month, or to pay a car repair. It could be to buy groceries tomorrow. It could be to pay for the mission trip, which you know God's told you to go on, and yet you're still waiting, and you're wondering, where's the money going to come from? And you know, we come to church, and we talk a lot about God, and we sing our praise songs, but do we really believe, that God will provide for us? And that's what we're going to look at this morning. So on the back of your bulletin, you'll see the outline of this message. The question is this: will God provide for me? Will God provide for me? And to answer it, we will be in Joshua chapter 21. So if you have your Bibles, open them or switch them on and go to Joshua chapter 21. Now, if you've downloaded our app, yep, here's another plug for it. If you were, for example, just to click on our app and the bottom right, go to More and click Bible, it would automatically take you to Joshua chapter 21 in the ESV version that I read from. And each week, by the way, if you click on Bible, it'll take you straight to the text that I will be sharing. So just another reason to have it right there. So we'll be in Joshua chapter 21. And just to give you an overview of what's going to happen, we've got two major movements to this message. So the first half of this message is going to focus on a group of people who did not have what they needed. The second half of the message will shift a little and will focus on a group of people who had more than they needed. And we'll see how God deals with both of them. So we've really got the have-nots and then the haves. And our story, a little-known story, is going to speak to both. So just before I start reading from Joshua 21, let me set the background. If you haven't been with us, we are studying our way through the book of Joshua. And this is a story about God leading his people into a new land. So Israel had been in Egyptian slavery for 400 years, and then through Moses they came out. You've got the Exodus, but then they were disobedient, and so they wandered in the desert for 40 years. And by the way, God still provided miraculously for them during that 40-year period. It's just an amazing example of the grace of God. You've got God's people living in disobedience, and he still provides for them. And then God raised up a new leader, our man Joshua, and led them into a new land. And they've conquered the land and they've settled it. And there are these 12 tribes that make up the nation of Israel. And they've each got a region. So they've each been given a region, a part of the new land. And God said, okay, I've provided miraculously for you in the past. I'm still going to provide for you now. It's just that this time the land is going to meet your needs. So you can farm it. You can use it to graze your cattle. You can raise a family and build your cities. And I'll provide for you through the land. And so they all had their land, with one exception. One tribe hadn't received any land at all. The tribe of Levi, the Levites. And so as we get to our story, there's a problem. One of the 12 tribes of Israel, the Levites, do not have any land, nowhere to live. So how or who will they be provided for? So, opening question, will God provide for me? Number one in your handout is this: God will always meet our needs. God will always meet our needs because God always provides for his people. Let me show you this from this story in Joshua chapter 21, and I'll start reading at verse 1. I'll read a couple of verses, pause, and explain it. Joshua 21:1 reads as follows. Then the heads of the fathers' houses of the Levites, this tribe of Levi, they came to Eleazar the priest and to Joshua the son of Nun and to the heads of the fathers' houses of the tribes of the people of Israel. And they said to them at Shiloh in the land of Canaan, that's the promised land, they said this: the Lord commanded through Moses that we be given cities to dwell in, to live in, along with their pasture lands for our livestock. All right, just stop there. This is what has just taken place. The leadership in one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Levi, the Levites, so the leaders of the Levites, they called a meeting. And they asked Joshua to be there. They asked Eleazar, the high priest, to be there. They asked all of the leaders of the other 11 tribes to be there. And at that meeting, they said, guys, you all have land. We don't. But do you remember years ago, before we came into the land, years ago, under the leadership of Moses, God said you had to give us a place to live. You had to give us cities. You had to give us an area for us to graze our animals. And what they're doing is they're really pointing back to something God did say. And I'll read it to you. So this is Numbers 35. And you'll see on your handout there are all the additional verses I'm going to refer to. They're right there, so you can go back and double check them. But in Numbers 35, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses by the Jordan. So this is years prior. And he said this: command the people of Israel to give the Levites some of the inheritance, that's some of the land, so cities for them to live in. Give to them pasture lands around the cities, and those cities shall be theirs, shall be the Levites to live in, and those pasture lands shall be for their cattle. And so the Levites are saying, hey, remember, God said that years ago. God said he's going to provide for us, that we should have cities. Now, you all have your cities, you all have your land, so we want somewhere to live in ourselves. Now, you may hear that and you may think, well, I don't get it. Why is this even an issue? If all of the other 11 12s of Israel, if they got land, then why did the Levites not get land? I mean, did Joshua not like them? Did Joshua forget about them? What's going on? Why did the Levites not have any land? And the reason is that God had said to, first of all, Joshua and then to Moses, don't give the Levites any land. And it's not because God didn't like them. It's because God had called them to do something very, very particular. You see, God had given a role to the Levites, to the tribe of Levi, that no other tribe in Israel was given, and that was to be the leaders in worship, to be the spiritual leaders of the entire nation. And because of that role, God didn't want them distracted by stuff, by land, by cities, by everything that comes with settling in the land. And so he'd actually said this in Joshua 13:33, to the tribe of Levi give no inheritance, because I, God, will be their inheritance. So the tribe of Levi, they were to be the go-between between the people and God. They were to teach the people about God. They were to lead the people in worship. They were the ones to carry the Ark of the Covenant. They were the ones to set up the tabernacle, this portable worship sanctuary. They were the ones to make the offering. And God said, this role is so important. This responsibility is so significant that I don't want you worrying about land and buildings. I'll provide for you. And the background to it is that God had said through Moses, when all of the other tribes, when the other 11 tribes come to bring their grain or their bread or their animals as an offering, the Levites are allowed to take part of that and to eat for themselves. So God has said, look, when all the other tribes bring stuff to be offered to me, the Levites can take a portion for themselves. So this would be Deuteronomy 18, verse 1. The tribe of Levi aren't to have any allotment of the land because they will live on the food offerings that are presented to me, God. So when they're on duty, serving, worshiping, God said they don't need to worry about providing because they can take part of all of the offerings that are brought. Don't be focusing on building the land, Levites. Be focused on building up the people spiritually. Be focused on leading them closer to me. Now, the problem with that is that they weren't always on duty. Yeah, they served on rotational basis. So they may serve for a couple of weeks and then be off for several months. So what were they supposed to eat during the time they're not on duty? They couldn't all live around the tabernacle. There were, at the last count in the book of Numbers, over 23,000 of them. Way too many either to live around the worship place or to take a share in the offerings that were being brought. So the problem is, where are they to live? Who's going to provide for them? If they don't have land, how on earth can they get food literally to sustain their lives? So there is a legitimate need here. And they raise it with Joshua. And what we're going to find is God's already met those needs. So let me read the next verse. Okay, Joshua 21, verse 3. So that means this is the result of that meeting. So the result of that meeting of the Levites saying, hey, remember, God said you've got to give us a place to live. So, verse 3, by command of the Lord, the people of Israel gave to the Levites the following cities and pasture lands out of their inheritance. And verses 4 to 8 give you an overview of who gave what, and then verse 9 through to verse 40, basically the rest of Joshua 21, describes in detail 48 cities that were given to the Levites to live in, and they were given each city, and there was a mile radius of land around each city, and that's where the cattle was going to graze. But you notice who did this in verse 3. This was by command of the Lord. This wasn't Joshua's idea. It's not Eleazar the priest's idea. This is God's command, God's instruction. And it's not a reactive idea either. It's not as though God woke up one morning and went, oh, crikey, I forgot the Levites. Oh, dang it, what am I going to do about them? You know, God had always been purposing that this was going to take place, which is why he'd said years earlier to Moses, you're going to have to do this when you get into the land. So he'd always been intentionally purposing that this would take place. And all of these cities and the rest of Joshua 21, they're all pre-existing cities. So he didn't say, okay, Joshua, build some new cities. He didn't say, okay, clear the land, build some new subdivisions, give those to the Levites. Now, these were pre-existing cities that God had always earmarked would be specifically set aside for his people, because God always meets the needs of his people. Now, what is interesting is that this tribe, the Levites, they weren't given the same quantity as all the other people of Israel. So these other 11 tribes, they've been given sort of huge tracts of land, vast areas, vast regions. And then you got the Levites, and they just get some cities. Yeah, just to try to illustrate that, that would be like you being given the state of North Carolina and the person next to you just being given Asheville. I know you think Asheville's heaven, okay? But just work with me on this. The difference would be significant. It's like one person gets this, and the next person gets this. So God may not necessarily have given them their wants, but he met their needs. Big difference. God always meets the needs of his people. And here, God had a plan for the tribe of Levi, a specific plan. And while he may not have given to them in the same way that others were given, he met every single need, and they did not go without. He called them to do something, and he gave them everything they needed for that. They needed somewhere to live, he gave them somewhere to live. They needed somewhere for their animals to graze, he gave them somewhere for their animals to graze. I had a pastor back in the UK who very frequently would be known to quote, "What God orders, God pays for." Yeah, whatever God asks you to do, God's going to provide for it. In just the same way that if you leave here today and you go out to a restaurant and you sit down and you open the menu, you're going to order what you know you've got the resources to pay, aren't you? You're not going to order if you know you can't pay for it. And here we see the story of God calling his people to do something and having the resources to meet every need so that they could do that. Because the principle is that God always meets the needs of his people. He can be relied on to do that. And that's not just something we see in isolation in Joshua chapter 21. That's validated throughout the whole of the narrative of your Bible. Here's just a couple of examples. Many of you have heard of the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. Yeah, Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. And you hear the name Joseph and you think, oh yeah, Joseph sold into slavery and then went to work for Pharaoh. That's true. It's part of the story. But the real storyline is that God allowed that to happen to provide for his people. Yeah, God sent Joseph through a very difficult period so that he would be raised up into a position of leadership so that he could give food and housing and shelter to this fledgling nation of Israel as they went through a famine. And Joseph knew that at the end of his life. So in Genesis 45, when he reveals himself to his brothers who think that he's been dead for years, Joseph said this, Genesis 45:5, "Don't be angry. Don't be upset with yourselves because you sold me here, because God sent me here to preserve life." This famine has been in the land for 2 years. There are another 5 years in which there'll be no harvest. God sent me before you to preserve a remnant on earth so that you would be survivors. Joseph knew that God always provides for his people and sometimes in an unexpected way. And I've already mentioned the nation of Israel right before Joshua, wandering in a wilderness, in a desert for 40 years. And if you don't know the story, for 6 days out of 7, they woke up and there was like an oatmeal substance on the floor. And they gathered it up and, they baked it, cooked it, and they could keep enough for the 7th day. It was a miracle every single day for 40 years. And sometimes he blew quail in on the wind. And other times he made water come out of a rock. Because God always meets the needs of his people. At the very end of last year, December 27th, I spoke about a story of a man called Elijah. Great prophet Elijah, several generations after Joshua. There was a stage in Elijah's life where he was really depressed. He wanted to die, and he ran from God, and God came to him, and God said, "Elijah, be encouraged, and I'm going to provide for you." And he sent him to a secluded location, and he fed him every single day by bringing in birds, ravens, with food in their mouth for Elijah to eat. And I know that really freaks out the germaphobes out there. So you need to get past that and see the principle again of God providing for his people. And you fast forward into the New Testament, and it's no different. Have you heard of the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000? It's the only miracle, there are two miracles that appear in all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Only two miracles do that, the feeding of the 5,000 and the resurrection. And there's a reason the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle to appear in each of the four Gospels, because it demonstrates this principle of God meeting the needs of his people. In that case, it shouldn't be called the feeding of the 5,000. It should be called the feeding of the almost 10,000, because we're told there were 5,000 men. So when you add in the women and children that would have been there would have been nearly 10,000 people that day. And they were fed with 5 loaves and 2 fish. So today, our story begins with a group of people who did not have what they needed. But God knew that. And God met that need, and he gave them exactly what they needed, because that's what God does. He always provides for his people. And sometimes it's in a very unexpected way. And other times it's in a way that we would imagine, and other times we might look at other people around us and it's as though God's giving them way more than he's giving us, but he meets our needs nevertheless. And so Paul, the Apostle Paul, knew about this in Philippians 4:19. He said, God will supply every need of yours in Christ Jesus. So be encouraged this morning. If you're looking at this mountain, wondering where will the money come from, if you're following Jesus, God will provide for you. He will meet your needs. So that's the first half of this message. The people who did not have what they needed. So now we're going to shift gears a little, and we're going to transition and look at those who had more than they needed and what God did through them. So number 2 on your outline, and just so you know, you're not going to like this. But number 2 reads as follows: God will use us to provide for others. God will use us to provide for others. God provides for his people, oftentimes by using the resources of his people. God provides for some by taking from the resources of others. You know, we just learned here that there was a tribe who were without, and God provided cities for them to live in. Did you catch where those cities came from? Let me reread verse 3, Joshua 21, verse 3. So by command of the Lord, the people of Israel gave to the Levites the following cities and pasture lands. Oh, now here it is, out of their inheritance. These cities that were given to the Levites came from the inheritance, the allotment, what had already been apportioned to the other 11 tribes of Israel. God said, some of my people are without, then I'm going to give and I'm going to meet their needs, but I'm going to do that from the rest of my people. God didn't give the Levites cities that were outside of the promised land. It's not as though Joshua stood there scratching his head and thought, well, I really don't know what to do right now because you all own the cities. I'll tell you what, we passed a dozen cities on the way to the promised land. Why don't you go and have those cities? So head out the promised land, toodaloo, and why don't you take those that we didn't take? Or, there are those cities up on the hill. We're probably not going to be able to settle those. So why don't you go and take the leftovers? None of that. God said, my people, you give them from what I have already given to you. And that's what Israel did. God had given them all plenty, and those 11 tribes took from their plenty, and they said, here, back to you, God, for your people, receive this back. And verses 4 to 8, you see that in overview. I'll give you a couple of examples, okay? Verse 4. The lot came out, that just means a method of choosing. So the lot came out for the clans of the Kohathites. And all you need to know, the Kohathites were a family clan within the tribe of Levi. Actually, the biggest family clan in the tribe of Levi. So this means land was chosen for the largest tribe the largest clan in Levite. And halfway through verse 4, this was from the tribes of Judah, Simeon, and Benjamin, 13 cities came from those three tribes. And then verse 5, the rest of the Kohathites, they received from the clans of the tribe of Ephraim, from the tribe of Dan, from the half tribe of Manasseh. And so it is with those verses. We are told, explicitly told, these 48 cities came from within the land that had already been given to Israel. God had said, okay, my people, here is more than you need. With the expectation is that when a need arises, you give back. And that's exactly what you see taking place. Because the principle is that God provides for his people and often uses his people to do so. That God gives with the expectation that his people give back to his work. What we see just sort of leaping out of this story is the people of God taking a portion of what God has given them and saying, here, God, you take this back from me. That's what the offering was a few moments ago, in the very last song, we take up the offering. The offering is a form of worship. The offering is us saying, okay, God, you've given us more than we need. Therefore, would you please take back a portion of it and use it for your work and for your glory? It's exactly what's taking place here. God gives excess so that others might benefit. And we have excess in the United States. I mean, if you live, the mere fact you live in the United States puts you among the wealthiest in the entire world. And I don't mean to belittle any difficult situation you're facing today. I don't want to belittle the financial mountain that you may be looking at today. But the mere fact that you live in the States means you are wealthier than virtually the rest of the world. And we're told, to whom much is given, much is expected. And this is so counterintuitive. The world says, my excess is mine, I'm going to hoard it, I will not share it because I've earned it and I deserve it. And God says, my people, I give you excess so that through that excess, you might be my hands and my feet. And let me validate this for you, because I don't want you to think I'm making this up. And I'm going to validate it from the New Testament through the lens of the church. Acts chapter 2, verse 44. All who believed, that means the church, all who believed they were together and they had all things in common. They sold their possessions and their belongings, and they distributed the proceeds to anyone who had any need. Acts chapter 4, verse 32. All of those who believed, that is the church, they were of one heart, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him were his own. In fact, they had everything in common. There wasn't a needy person among them. And anyone who had any need, owners of lands or owners of houses came, sold them, laid the proceeds at the feet of the leaders, the apostles, and it was distributed to anyone who had needs. 2 Corinthians 8:14, Paul said, church, right now you've got plenty, so you can help those who are in need. He said, later, if you're in need, they can take from their plenty and give it back to you. 2 Corinthians 9:11, you will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous in every way. And I can see you squirming, because we really don't like to hear this, because we don't like to give away what we have, because we think that's what we need. And God said, oh, everything you've got, I've given you, and you've got way more than you need, and I want you to return to me some of it. Think again of the story, the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 for a moment. This is often told through either the eyes of Jesus or the eyes of the disciples. Let's look at it through the eyes of the boy who had the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Okay, for me, it often helps if I imagine myself as Steven Spielberg, sort of directing a movie. So let's say for a moment that we're filming a movie of the feeding of the 5,000. So the scene is set, this green pasture land or a soft rolling mountain, and it's just littered with people. There's people everywhere. There's between 5,000 and 10,000 people, and they've been following Jesus and they've been listening to Jesus. But as the day wears on, they're hungry. Stomachs are rumbling. Camera zooms in on a few people sort of rubbing their stomach and saying, well, did you bring any food? No. Did you? No. Any food trucks? No. And then the camera sort of zooms in on a teenage boy who earlier that morning, flashback in the movie, is in his home. He's heard about this Jesus guy and thinks he'll go and listen to him. Realizes he may be away from home for a day or maybe even two, and so he opens a little brown bag and puts in 5 small loaves, and not big loaves, 5 small loaves and a couple of dried smoked fish. Rolls up his brown bag and off he goes. And come back to the scene, and people are hungry, and so our teenage boy looks around, opens up his bag, smells great, he's hungry, he's ready for this, and he's just about to reach in and take out a bite when he hears someone walking through the crowd asking, does anyone have any food? Does anyone have any food? And the camera zooms out, and we see the disciples walking through the crowd. Has anyone got any food? Has anyone got any food? And in our movie, certainly in my movie, so our teenager goes, and one of the disciples comes up to him, sort of kneels down next to him. The camera zooms in, and he says, son, what do you have there? 5 loaves, small loaves, a couple of fish. I'm hungry, it's my tea, it's my evening's meal, maybe some breakfast tomorrow. There's not a lot, I'm so sorry, no, I don't have any food. Will you give it to me? Will you let me take it and give it to Jesus and see what he can do with it? All right, pause filming. All right, press pause on your DVD. What would you do? Because if I'm directing this, my teenage boy does this. Because then I'll go without. Then I'll be hungry. But that's not the story, is it? The story is camera zooms in and he hands it over. And the disciples take it to Jesus. Jesus blesses it, breaks it, and feeds almost 10,000 people, including our little boy. And in fact, the Gospel of John contains this great little couple of phrases, couple of verses at the end of the feeding of the 5,000. Only John does this. That afterwards, the disciples picked up over 12 basketfuls full of leftovers. I mean, can you imagine the size of the to-go box to deal with all of those leftovers? Why? Because God always meets the needs of his people, and he often uses his people to do so. So let me ask you, today, would you be that little boy? Or would you be these other 11 tribes of Israel? Would you return to God, part of what he's given you, so that he can use that to meet the needs of others? Because God wants to use us to meet the needs of others. He wants to do that. And there's this amazing thing that takes place when we see this happen. So first of all, the person receiving gets blessed tremendously because they've had a need and they've prayed to God and God's met that need and they've seen God at work. But the double blessing is the giver. The person who gives is blessed as they trust God with what they have, is blessed as they see that they can be the hands and feet of Jesus. And this wonderful thing happens. So what are we going to do with this? If this is your first morning at New Life, I said last night and I said this morning that you need to know something about me as the preacher. I never leave things at the academic or theoretical level. So we're never just going to walk our way through a text and say, that's what that means, and leave it there. Because if we do, we just become spiritually arrogant. And I'm not in the business of building up your arrogance at all. You're already arrogant enough for all of us. And I just say that? I was thinking, I didn't mean to say it. But so am I. So am I. And so I always want there to be takeaway. So I always want you to be able to take this away and say, okay, I understand it, but I now know what I have to do about it. And so that's what we're going to do now. But just before we get to these 2 challenge questions, I have to finish telling the story that I started. Started with a story about leaving legal practice and going through this really difficult moment of having a financial mountain ahead of me and just not knowing how God was going to deal with that. This is what I did. I did the only thing I knew what to do, and I prayed about it. And that afternoon, as I put the phone down on my bank, and I could not imagine how God was going to deal with this. And I began questioning everything that had brought us to that point. And I said, God, I do not get this. Why are you allowing this to happen? Because I thought I was following you, and now I can't see past this. Where will the money come from? The following day, I had a phone call from one of my partners. Now, I can't overstate how acrimonious that meeting the day earlier had been with my partners. It was awful. It did not end well. And the following day, I had a call from one of them, and he said, Martin, I've been thinking about what you said and what you're doing. And I want to offer you a 12-month consultancy agreement with the firm after you've left. I want you to stay on part-time. I want you to guide us through and to find your replacement. And if you do that, I will give you this amount of money up front right now. And it was 1/2 to the penny of what I needed, exactly 50%. So what did I say? I said, yeah, okay, I'll do that for the next 12 months. Put the phone down and said, okay, God, great, but how am I going to get the rest? A few hours later, I had a phone call from a Christian gentleman who'd had an investment mature and wanted to make a distribution among certain people that he knew, and I was one of them. And the amount he said he wanted to give me was exactly 1/2 of what I'd needed the previous day. So within just a few hours, God provided in a way that blew me away. It was a mountain that I perceived stood in the way of anything I was about to do for God. And it was as though God said, you think that's a mountain? That's a grain of sand. You just watch how I'm going to deal with that. And since we have taken that step of faith, God has provided so well for us. You know, sometimes it's been in the most expected way. So we left England with some savings. And sometimes I'd look at the bank account and say, well, God, you're providing through those. Thank you so much. And sometimes I'd be asked to preach at different churches or to do weddings or funerals or to speak at retreats. And the money came from expected avenues. And other times it came from very unexpected avenues. I've shared previously in a previous message a while ago that while I was in Dallas, the church in Dallas, I began meeting with an older gentleman. We began, the two of us sort of walking the path of what it means to follow Jesus. And we've been meeting for several months, and I was meeting with him one morning, and he said something that just didn't sit right with me. I mean, a red flag went off. And I said, can we just go back and just talk about that for a moment? And as we began talking about it, I realized that there was a sin issue in his life that needed to be dealt with. He needed to be called out on something. And I did. And I tried to be gracious about it, but that meeting didn't go well either. He left our meeting. He actually left the church over that meeting. A few days later, I was out washing my car on the driveway, and all this was going through my head, and he pulls up. He gets out his car, starts walking towards me. I thought he was just going to floor me. And he looked at me, and he said, I totally disagree with what you said, but God's told me I've got to give you this. Shoves an envelope in my hands full of money, gets in his car, drove away, and I've never seen him since. And I often think I need to offend more people. Yeah, give me time. It'll happen. Don't worry. So, challenge questions. Number one is this. Challenge question number one. Do I trust God enough to provide for me? Do I trust God enough to provide for me? Now, this presupposes you're already trusting God. If you're here this morning and you've never taken the step of faith to put your life in the hands of Jesus Christ, that's why you're here right now, because God loves you so much in spite of sin, rebellion, mistakes, wickedness, you name it. He loves you so much that he sent his son, Jesus Christ, for you to erase all of that and to give you a fresh start, and that fresh start comes through faith, through belief in Jesus. And that's why you're here right now. Now, for others of you, you've made that decision. Will you trust God to provide for you? And I know we talk about this, but do you really trust him? Some of you right now are waiting for God to provide. I know you are. And that wait can be very difficult, can't it? But will you trust him? Lay your worry at the foot of the cross of the one who gave his life for you. And listen to what he said, Luke 12:22. Do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on, because life is more than food. Your body's more than clothing. Consider that the birds, the ravens, they don't sow or reap. They're not panicking about where their meal's coming from, in other words. They don't have storehouses. They don't have barns, and yet God feeds them. How much more valuable are you to God than those birds? So some of you this morning need to take a step of faith because you know God's called you or asked you to do something, and the only reason you're not doing it is because the money's not there. That shouldn't be the reason. If you know God's asked you to do something, the money should not be what's holding you back. Now, make sure God's asked you to do it. And if there's any doubt, make sure that you've taken prayerful, wise counsel from other believers. But if you know, then you don't wait for the money. You take that first step, and you see what God does to meet the needs. For others of you, second challenge question is this: do I trust God enough to let him use my resources to provide for others? Do I trust God enough to use what I have, my excess, whether great or small, for the benefit of someone else? And this is the radical part. This is the part we do not like because we want it. We want to keep hold of it. And God says, that's not why I gave it to you, though, is it? Listen to something else Jesus said in Luke 12 from verse 16. The land of a rich man produced plentifully. So this guy had loads of stuff. And so he thought to himself, well, what shall I do? I've got nowhere to store all of my crops. In other words, I've got so much, I don't know what to do with it. And he said, I'll do this. I will tear down my barns, so I'll tear down my existing barns, and I'll build bigger barns, and there I'll store all of my grain and all of my goods. So I'm going to make myself bigger places to put all of my stuff. And then I'll say to my soul, soul, you've got ample goods. I actually love that. It's like this guy saying, and then I will say to myself, self, you know, you've got a lot of stuff, haven't you? So just take it easy, relax, enjoy life. But God said to that man, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. And then who's going to get everything you've stored up and prepared? And Jesus said, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself, but is not rich towards God. Will you use what God has given you to benefit others? You may already know someone that's in need, and God's already tugging at your heart. You need to go help them. As you leave here, this morning, there's 2 white boxes on the wall on the way out. It's got $1 box written on it. And every week we encourage people just to drop $1 in on their way out. If everyone dropped $1 in the $1 box on the way out, that money goes into our confidential benevolence fund that some of our leadership here use in absolute confidence to meet the needs in the body. And if we all put $1 in, that fund would overflow. In fact, you don't have to only put $1 in. You can put, I'm going to let you, okay? I'm going to let you put more than $1 in. You may know people that are going on mission and need scholarshiping. They need help. And I'm just going to tell you, we've got over 30 people going on international mission trips, and there are people who still need financial help. And if you want to know, then come and speak to me. How will we use the resources God has given us? Because, folks, I have zero desire or interest just to do church if we simply read a text and go, oh, hoo-ha, yes, and then do nothing with it. This has got to change lives. And it starts right now. Let's pray about this. Father, forgive me if I have overstepped the mark this morning. Forgive me if I have spoken out of turn. If I've said something in the wrong way, then I pray that you would remove it from every mind that's here. But leave the truth and use me to convey the truth. It overwhelms me every week that you do. It overwhelms me to look back over my life and to see how you have provided. You've done miracles. And I thank you that you are the God who meets needs. We do not go without. As we follow you, as we follow Jesus, every need is met, and I pray that that would be the message emblazoned on every heart and mind this morning. And so especially for those who are struggling right now, would you provide for them? And those who have more than they need right now, would you use them to reach out as your hands and your feet because of Jesus? Amen.